Hi folks. In this story set, you're reading from Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, and the theme of this story set are narratives of slavery and for abolition. This tradition within the American literary canon is an important one for social change and progress, but also as an illustration of the power of literature and how it really helped to shape a lot of the American identity and change that was happening at the time. So if you'll recall, in our timeline, we're in the 1800s, and the tradition of what's called slave narratives began in the late 1700s, and often these were narratives of passage from Europe to the New World. But as we progress into the 1800s, you start to see this tradition really take off and become a big part of what was the abolition movement. These narratives are sometimes considered within the Romanticism movement of the canon, but I think, yeah, and that has validity to it. However, I think that can almost be a bit reductive because these are not pieces of literature, sort of appealing to emotion. These are pieces of literature that absolutely are true and reveal the reality of what the country was like for enslaved people, and that was a huge motivator of social change at the time. Now, the first author that you're reading is the incomparable Frederick Douglass. Probably the most iconic slave narrative in history is Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass, which was his first memoir on his experiences. But he was born into slavery in Maryland in 1817 or 1818. And I think that it's, this is sometimes surprising to people because when you think of slavery, you often think of the North versus the South. But, there was enslavement happening all over the country, and there were a lot of, what we would consider northern parts of the U.S. that were still very much, entrenched in this, barbaric practice. So he was born into slavery, and he was separated from his family, as was was common within the enterprise of slavery, at the age of 6, and went to go and was taken to the home of Thomas Auld, and Thomas Auld lent him to his brother Hugh and his wife Sophia, where he spent most of his childhood in Talbot County, Maryland. So Sophia, the matriarch of this family, did teach Frederick Douglass the alphabet and started to teach him to read before Hugh, her husband, sort of put a stop to it. And he, in Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass, he writes about how Hugh said, basically, if he learns to read, there will be no keeping him. He'll be unfit to be a slave. And so essentially this idea that if Black Americans at the time were able to read and write, that the enterprise of slavery would fall. And that had plenty of truth to it. But Frederick Douglass, Sophia sort of stopped these lessons, and then she started hiding literature from him, including Bibles and things like that. But Frederick Douglass sought literacy on his own terms, learned to read and write, and also, sort of created a community among other enslaved people where they were to learn to read and write and advocate in this way. Now, under the Aulds, Frederick Douglass was a body servant, meaning he worked in their home, but eventually, as a teenager, he was lent out to a farmer by the name of Covey. Mr. Covey is what he's called in Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass. And Mr. Covey was known as a brutal slave owner and what's called a slave breaker. Essentially, Frederick Douglass was sent here to be broken back into compliance, and that did not go well for Mr. Covey. So Frederick Douglass was brutally beaten for years of his life until one day he fought back. And this is the chapter in his narrative known as The Last Flogging, which I'll share with you in notes and resources. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. But essentially, one day he fought back physically. And after that, Mr. Covey never touched Frederick Douglass again. Now, eventually Frederick Douglass escaped to freedom by escaping to New York and married a free black woman, and he began writing and giving speeches on the topic of slavery. So he is one of the most well-known figures in the abolition movement, certainly. He was the most photographed man in the 19th century, in the 1800s. And his narrative in the life of Frederick Douglass really established what many people in the country were either turning a blind eye to or refusing to believe, and that was that Black Americans and enslaved people were every bit as capable, eloquent, articulate, intelligent as any other American. And it really sort of called attention to the horror and barbarity of the slavery enterprise. And not only is narrative in the life of Frederick Douglass, at the time, many people didn't even believe that a black man could write this, but not only did he write it, Frederick Douglass is arguably one of the best writers of the 19th century, and he became a huge advocate for abolition throughout his life, gave many, many speeches, and you all are reading What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which was a speech that he delivered, on behalf of, the abolition movement leading up into the Civil War. I do think it's interesting to know about Frederick Douglass that he eventually advocated to President Lincoln that black men should be allowed to fight in the Union Army during the Civil War, and that black men and enslaved people should be allowed to not only show their worth and capability as Americans, but to also show their commitment to the American identity. And arguably, Frederick Douglass had a huge influence as a catalyst for the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation, as you know, abolished slavery, but it also effectively was the end of the Civil War, because what happened is all of these enslaved people and Black Americans abandoned the Confederate Army, and they were the labor force. They were the ones making all of the things that the Confederate Army needed, and this advocacy for them to fight on behalf of the Union was spearheaded in many ways by Frederick Douglass. The second text you are reading is a series of excerpts from Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. This was the first fugitive slave narrative written by a woman. It was incredibly influential and incredibly important in terms of exposing what Black women specifically were experiencing within the slavery enterprise. So Harriet Jacobs was born into slavery in 1813, but for the first several years of her life, she actually had no idea that she was the legal property of her owner, who taught her to read and write. But eventually, her owner dies, and in her will she leaves Harriet and her brother to her niece. Her niece at the time is 3, so she becomes the sort of indirect property of a man by the name of Dr. James Norcom, and this man would become her owner essentially for most of her life. And Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl really depicts the sexual harassment and victimization that she faced at the hands of Dr. Norcom, who essentially harassed and intimidated her sexually and psychologically for her whole life, beginning when she was a young girl, a teenage girl. Her grandmother was a free Black woman, and she did have a relationship with her, and although her grandmother, did want to help her reach her freedom, there were just a lot of barriers in the way, and it was very dangerous for them to do so. So eventually, Harriet Jacobs, in sort of an act of desperation, starts a relationship with a man named Samuel Sawyer. This is a white lawyer who was part of the North Carolina elite. He eventually became a member of the House of Representatives. And with Samuel Sawyer, Harriet Jacobs has 2 children. Now, this outrages Dr. Norcom, and his wife, Mrs. Norcom, had also been very psychologically and abusive towards Harriet Jacobs, because she was essentially very jealous that her husband had taken such an interest in this young Black woman. So, upon learning about her pregnancy, the Norcombs forbid her from returning to her home, and she goes to stay with her grandmother for a period of time before the Norcombs decide to sell her to their son into a plantation. Now, throughout this period of time, she is still technically the legal property of Dr. Norcomb while she's living with her grandmother, and he continues with his psychological and sexual harassment after the birth of her children and throughout her pregnancy. And then he, sells her to his son. She eventually decides that she's going to escape. And she does, and sort of flees in the middle of the night. And then she spends the next period of her life in the very dangerous predicament that is being a fugitive. Due to fugitive slave laws, if she was found, she would be returned to Dr. Norcomb, and, shudder to think of the sort of horrifying things that could have become her if she was returned to him. So she actually hid in her grandmother's attic crawl space for 7 years, sort of waiting out her time to eventually, rescue her children and to reach freedom. Now, while she is a runaway, she's also writing letters to Dr. Norcomb to confuse him about her whereabouts. She's staying in hiding, and Dr. Norcomb, in his sort of evil quest for revenge, sells her children and her brother. But unbeknownst to Dr. Norcomb, the trader that he sold her children to was in cahoots with Samuel Sawyer. And if you'll remember, Samuel Sawyer is the father of her children. Now, while Harriet Jacobs, had hopes that this would mean that he would manumit them or free them, Samuel Sawyer is also not a great, advocate, and he gets elected to the House of Representatives, gets married, and basically abandons him. Now, eventually, Harriet Jacobs is able to escape to New York via the Maritime Underground Railroad. So she also details that account in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and she is able to essentially gain her children's freedom. Her daughter, Louisa, also became an advocate and activist, and Harriet Jacobs became a very outspoken sort of author who exposed specifically the trauma of slavery as it affected women and their mothers and their daughters. And so, of course, this is a very important account of what was going on at the time and what sort of social change these formerly enslaved people were advocating for leading up to the Civil War. As you're reading these, I want you to think about not only what these writers are describing, but I also want you to think about how they are using their voice and using their artistry to advocate for social change, to expose the flaws of slavery, and to also establish their own dignity as part of the American fabric and as part of the American literary tradition. I look forward to hearing what you all think about these.